has 96 passages, and the mnemonic for Tzav is Ya'av, which is the first mnemonic, and Solu, which is the second mnemonic. What does Ya'av mean? Ya'av apparently comes from this week's Torah portion in chapter 27. It talks about the obligation to build a mizbeach, an altar. And there the Torah says, in addition to making the altar, in verse number 3 it says, Vasisa siresav, you shall also make its pots, to clear away the ashes, and its shovels, to lift up the ashes and put it into the pots, to take it off the altar. So Yav means shovels. And the question comes to mind, why does the rabbis of the Masoretic notes choose the word Ya'av, which happens to have the gematria of 96, to encapsulate the entire portion, when we're dealing here with the portion of Terumah, such a rich portion, dealing with all of the different vessels that were made in the Holy Temple. And of the holy vessels, we had the ark, and we had the menorah, and we had the tabernacle, the shulchan, etc., etc. Why would they choose the word Yav, which is a shovel? Now, it's true, the shovel was very important, for it was the sine qua non of the altar, because if you do not remove the ashes, you cannot bring sacrifices there every day. However, why is it that this encapsulates, and this is the theme of the entire portion, which is Ya'av, and that is the shovel? The second siman is Solu. Solu apparently comes from Isaiah. Over there we read on Yom Kippur, in the morning in the Haftorah of Isaiah, where Isaiah says, Solu, Solu, pave for yourself and clear the road. Why would you read the Solu, this word Solu, when we read the portion of Terumah? What does this add to the portion? And as we spoke many times, that really all we need is one mnemonic. The fact that we have two mnemonics is apparently telling us that there's additional insight to the Parsha. How do we understand all of this? So the rabbis tell us that there are 96 psukim in the Parsha. 96 is the word tzav. Tzav can mean 96, but tzav is also a word. Tzav is not only a word, but tzav is also a parsha in the Torah. It's called the portion of tzav. And therefore our rabbis are telling us, look into the portion of tzav to understand why we chose the word yav to be the mnemonic of the parsha. So we turn to the parsha of tzav. And what does it say over there? It says that there's a mitzvah every day for the Kohen to take the ashes off of the altar. And after he takes the ashes off the altar, he puts the ashes eitzel hamizbeach, near the actual altar. He puts it on the floor in the temple. Then after that it says, the Kohen is to change his garments, take off his priestly garments and put on other garments, and remove the ashes from that spot, and take it outside of the camp, b'chutz lamachane, and bring it to a holy place, and there you are to leave those ashes. Says Rashi, why is it that the Kohen must change his garments when he removes the ashes from the floor of the temple to take it outside of the temple, outside of the camps? Says Rashi, because the cook who is cooking for the king should not wear the same garments as the butler that serves the king the cup of wine. When you pour the king the cup of wine, you should have one set of garments, and you should not wear the same garments that you wore in the kitchen when you were preparing the food. And that is why you are to change the clothing. In other words, from the portion of Tzav, we see that there are two levels and two steps towards the removal of the ashes. One is they first took the ashes off the altar, put it on the side, eitzel hamizbeach, near the altar. After that, the Kohen would change his garments and take the ashes from near the altar and take it outside of the temple. What is the message that the Torah is telling us? And what is the lesson of the Parsha? The lesson is that many of us are concerned about the mitzvah itself. To put on the tefillin, to light the Shabbos candles, to eat the matzah on Pesach, to eat in a sukkah on Sukkot, to put on the tefillin every day. But we forget that there's also the hachana, the preparation of the mitzvah. And the hachana, the preparation of the mitzvah. That is also important. And that means not only to eat food on Shabbos, but also to buy the food before Shabbos and to cook this food before Shabbos. Not only to light the candles Friday night, but also to prepare to make sure there's a beautiful silver candlestick and to shine the candlestick. And to put the candle into the candlestick and to make sure the candle is sitting properly in the candlestick. These are all preparations to the mitzvah, which is also equally as important. And the same is true, yes, you have to eat matzah on Pesach, but there's also the obligation to bake the matzah, to watch the wheat from the time of harvest, and to grind it properly, and to go and to make sure that it's done within 80 minutes. All of these hachanot, all of these preparations are also important. And yes, it's important to eat in the sukkah and to make a bracha on the 4 species, but you also have to buy the wood to build the sukkah. And you say, well, I don't have to buy the wood or build the sukkah. I'll leave that for somebody else. I'm higher, I'm more important, I'm more godly, I'm more spiritual, I'm more devout. It's not for me, it's beneath my dignity. Comes the Torah and says no. The portion of Terumah talks about the menorah and talks about the holy ark and all of these holy vessels, but you know what? Says the rabbis that the mnemonic of the Parsha is Ya'av. Ya'av is the shovel that takes out the ashes. It's all about the preparation. It's all about the additional aspects of the mitzvah that are perhaps not so praiseworthy or not so glorious, that really makes a person connect with God. For that shows us that we're not doing it for the limelight, but simply to fulfill God's will in a beautiful and a proper manner. The Gemara says, Kama gedolim ma'aseh chia. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi speaks about the greatness of his disciples, Rabbi Chia. What did Rabbi Chia do? He said that I make sure that the Torah will never be lost from the Jewish people. Why? What do I do? He says, first of all, I take seeds of flax and I plant it. And after I sow these seeds and it grows, I weave nets. And after I weave nets, what do? I catch deer. And after I catch the deer, I shecht it, I slaughter it, and I give the meat to children who are orphans. So these orphan children can have meat. And I take the parchment, and on the parchment, I write the 5 books of Moses. And then I take 1 book of Moses, I give it to 1 child, and another book to a 2nd child, and a 3rd book to a 3rd child, and a 4th book to a 4th child, and a 5th book to a 5th child. And I teach them, myself, the Torah. And the child learns the Torah and knows the Torah, and then I tell him, now you teach it to somebody else. Rabbi Chia was a brilliant scholar. He did not simply say, I will buy a chumash in the store, and I will teach it to a child. No. He took the seeds, and he sowed the seeds, and he harvested the seeds, and he prepared the actual traps, and he caught the deer on his own, and he slaughtered the deer on his own, and he wrote the Torah on his own. Why? Because to Rabbi Chia wasn't only the finished product, it was also the path to the finished product. Every detail of the mitzvah was so holy and so important that Rabbi Chia did not share it with anybody else, though he could have delegated it. He did it on his own. He understood the importance of the details, of the preparation to the mitzvah itself is also holy. And the same is true when it comes to teach another Jew, a Jew who perhaps is outside of the camps of Israel. It's not enough that, well, if he walks into the synagogue, I'll sit down and I'll study the Torah with him. but rather you have the obligation to go out of the synagogue, outside all of the camps, mechutz lamachane, and there to teach that Jew as well. And even though you have to take your garments off, because you can't talk to him the vernacular of the Hebrew, you can't talk to him the vernacular of Torah and mitzvahs, he is so far, he has no idea what these things are. So first you talk to him his language, philosophy, science, etc., etc. And then after that you're able to bring him in. All of this is part of being a Kohen. It was the Kohen that did this, not an average person. And we are Mamlechas Kohanim v'Goy Kodesh, we are truly a holy people. And we are a people of Kohanim, we are a people of priests. And therefore we too must follow in the ways of the Torah. And therefore we find in this portion of Terumah, we have these two mnemonics. Number one is Ya'av, which is the shovel, alluding to the first preparation of the mitzvah. And then Solu, which is a path that takes us out of the holy temple. A path that takes us outside to michutz lamachane, outside the camps. And there too, even though we have to travel a far distance with the road, even there we have the obligation to prepare for the mitzvah. And similarly, Yav represents another Jew who's not on the altar. He's not fit to go onto the altar. He's not knowledgeable enough to go onto the altar. He simply ate Sel HaMizbeach on the side of the altar. You have to go off the altar and teach that person. And then perhaps you find another Jew who's mechutz lamachane, who will never dare to step foot into a synagogue. That Jew also, you have to go outside of the synagogue, outside of the camps. And you have to change your clothing to talk his vernacular. And there too, bring him the Torah, and there too, tzav, which means connection, connect that person with God. And that is called making a dwelling place for God, not only in the synagogue, but also outside of the camp. There's another approach. And that is that the concept of afer, the concept of ashes. What is the concept of ashes on the altar? Normally you took an animal, and you put the animal onto the mizbeach, onto the altar. Says the Talmud that a fire came down from heaven, and it consumed the sacrifice. And therefore the fire within the animal became one with the fire, and the ear went up into the ear, and the water went up into the clouds. But the part of earth that was in the sacrifice did not become elevated. It could not become elevated. It remained down here below. And therefore, what does that mean? Says the Tzemach Tzedek that the Arizal teaches us that there are two levels of birurim. There are two levels of refining the sparks. One level is to elevate the spark. And then there's another level where the sparks cannot be elevated, and therefore it falls down to a lower world. So, for example, if the sacrifice is to reach the world of Yitzira or Bria, then the ashes cannot be refined, then we have to refine the ashes in the lower world. And therefore there are two levels of refinement. There's Ya'av, there's the shovel, alluding to the first level of refinement when it cannot be refined in a higher world, when it cannot be refined on the Mizbeach, it cannot be refined on the altar. So therefore we have to refine it next to the altar, through the shovel. And then there's an even lower level of refinement. When that cannot be elevated, we have to bring it outside the camp and refine it over there. What does that mean on a day-to-day basis? So the Rebbe explains that in our daily life, in our daily service to God, there's something which is called mitzvah, and that is one of the 613 commandments. And those commandments are holy. They go onto the altar. Then there's a whole different world, a whole different arena of reality, and that is called rishus. Rishus means it's permissible. For example, to work every day. The Torah says 6 days a week shall you work. But working is not holy. So therefore it cannot be on the altar. But yet at the same time it plays its role. Where is it? It's next to the altar. What does that mean? We are told in the book of Mishlei, in the book of Proverbs, B'chol drechecha de'ehu, in all your ways you are to know God. And furthermore we're told in the book of Ethics of our Fathers, Kol ma'asecha yiyu l'shem shemayim, all of your actions should be for the sake of heaven. So there are two levels. One is all your actions are for the sake of heaven. To mean that at the beginning it's my action. In other words, I'm hungry, I sit down, I broil a good steak, I'm chaya, I sit down, I eat it, I have french fries and ketchup, I'm having a good time. It's kosher, of course, I make a bracha beforehand, but I'm eating it for myself. My intention is eventually, after I finish eating, and I have now energy, now what do I do with the energy? I have energy, I get up, I'll go to shul, daven ma'ariv, I'll pray to God. I have energy, I'll sit down, I'll study Torah. I have energy, I'll do an errand, I'll help a Jew who's in despair, I'll help an old lady cross the street, I'll pay a call to a hospital, to an ill person, I'll use my energy to help other people. But the actual eating was for myself. And then there's a higher level. I'm eating right now. Why? Because I need the energy to serve God. And therefore, as a priori, I sit down and I eat. Furthermore, I go to work. Why? So that at work, I can use that the opportunity to inspire another person. I use the work so I can show the rest of the world how a God-fearing person acts in a workplace. So it's not only that eventually I will use out my profits to give charity, but the whole essence of why I'm there is for the sake of heaven. And that is the meaning of B'chol drechecha de'ehu. In all of your ways, you know God. It's your ways. It is something which is voluntary. It's not mitzvah. It cannot be on the mizbeach, on the altar. It has to be removed from the mizbeach. But yet, it is right near the altar. It is eitzel ha-mizbeach, right near the holy altar. Because all of these actions, this ash that you do, is also near the Mizbeach, is also needed and essential for a Jew and a person in his daily life. And if you cannot do this for the sake of God from A to Z, then you take it outside of the camp. In other words, I'm doing it for myself. It's kosher, it's voluntary, it's pariv, but eventually it will be for the sake of heaven. And therefore must go outside of the camp. I have to change my garments when I bring out these ashes. Because of the fact that you cannot use the same garments to cook that you use to serve the wine to the king. In other words, if I do everything for God, I don't have to change my garments. But if, for some reason, I do these actions for myself, I need to change my garments. For cooking represents passion. To boil or to broil or to bake is fire. Normally my fire should be used for God. But if for some reason I don't, I must change my garments. But ultimately everything is for the sake of heaven. And therefore you have three levels. You have the altar, which is the mitzvah itself. You have near the altar, which is to do voluntary, everyday work for the sake of God from A to Z. And finally, even if you don't do it totally at the beginning for the sake of God, but ultimately you realize that the entire success and the entire blessing and the entire energy that you acquire from this job or from this food or from this action is also dedicated for God. And even then one becomes a Kohen, even then one is holy. It's interesting to note that the Rambam says that there was never a time that a Kohen refused to remove the ashes from the Holy Temple. There was never a time that he was lazy or he procrastinated when it came to removing the ashes to michutz lamachane, outside the camp. Why? Because that too is a holy act. And therefore, regardless of what level of birur, of refinement we find ourselves, every level has its connection to God, and every level one can become a Kohen. The Tzemach Tzedek translates this a bit differently. And he says as follows: when one is on the altar, one is connected to God. Sometimes you make a mistake, you sin, you violate the Torah law. So now you have to be removed from the altar. You can no longer be on this high pedestal to become one with God, but rather you have to be removed from the Mizbeach. So a person feels embarrassed, he has busha. He feels embarrassed because of his sin. If that is the case, if you feel embarrassed, you could still be next to the altar. Because busha, embarrassment, is the same letters as shuva, which means to return. So through embarrassment, it's going to bring me back to God. However, if a person has atzlus or atzvus, if a person becomes melancholy and a person becomes depressed, that already is sinful. Then you must be taken outside of the camps of Israel. Because there's no place for such service, there's no place for such a character, there's no place for such an emotion within the temple of God. And even there, ultimately, one can do tshuva and transform his sadness into joy, which connects us with the month of Adar. This month that we now enter into, it says, Mishenichnas Adar, Marbim B'Simcha. When the month of Adar arrives, we increase in joy. It does not say when the month of Adar arrives, you should be joyous, implying that the rest of the year you could be sad. No. Throughout the rest of the year, we have to be joyous. Comes along the month of Adar, we increase in joy. In other words, the joy is there all year round, because a Jew must always be joyous. However, in the month of Adar, you have to now add to that element of joy. And therefore, there's no place for atzvus, there's no place for melancholy or depression. That has to be totally thrown out outside of the camps of Israel. So we have 96 psukim, which is tzav. And then we have one siman, which is ya'av, which is shovel. Another siman, which is Solu, which is the path. The Haftorah that we read on Yom Kippur, that God says shalom, peace, is to the one that is close, and also peace to the one that is far, for he too will become close. The idea of tshuva. But if you add 96 plus 96 plus 96, what do you have? You have 288. We know that in Kabbalah it says, when God created the world, there was the breaking of the vessels, known as Shvirat HaKelim, and from there came 288 sparks. When the Jews left the land of Egypt, it says, Olu Eidev Rav, the Eidev Rav went up with them, the mixed multitude. Rav is 202. Already they elevated 202 sparks of the 288. And this is the mission of history. And this is the mission of a Jew, to refine all of these 288 sparks. I can refine some by doing a mitzvah on the altar. I refine others by doing mitzvahs next to the altar. And then there are those that I refine by going outside the camp. But all of these three levels are connected with the 288 sparks, which is alluded in the very, very first chapter of the Torah. There it says, V'ruach elikim merachefes apanei hamoyim. It says God created the world. The world was tohu v'voyu, was null and void and chaotic. But the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and says the Talmud, this is the Spirit of Mashiach. The word merachefes, hovered, are the same letters as rapach. In other words, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, alluding to the 288 sparks in which it created in the world so that it will be refined. And through that, one will bring about the ultimate coming of Mashiach, the Geula, the redemption, which was the purpose of creation. And so therefore, make sure when you go home, you help out in the kitchen, you help out to cook in the kitchen, and you also take the garbage when you're finished, after dinner in the kitchen. So this is the blessing of Tzav, to make a holy temple for God, not only on the Temple Mount, and not only in the Mishkan in the desert, but wherever a person finds himself. If he does it, l'shem shemayim, for the sake of heaven, there too he has this connection, and there too he fulfills the creation, and there too he has the ability to bring about the coming of Mashiach speedily in our days.